that's it really for Auburn and Texas A&M. But we want to talk real quick about Georgia and South Carolina, and we're also going to get into this week for you podcast listeners. And obviously it'll be posted on YouTube. Our commentary on Florida firing Coach Mack and what we think about that. But I want to remind you, Georgia and South Carolina fans, because we usually do this at the end. We're going to do it again at the beginning. Thumbs up if you like it. Thumbs down if you don't, but you owe us a comment as to why. We're totally okay with you disagreeing with us, even thumbs down on us. Just tell us why. If you love what we're talking about on this channel, if you love the deep, nerdy analysis in our computer model that is killing Vegas this year, by the way, man, how about a subscribe? We'd love to get you that content every single week, week in and week out. Also, South Carolina fans, Georgia fans, give us your score predictions in the comments below. So we're going to get right into this game. South Carolina coming off a win against Vanderbilt last weekend. We would have liked to have seen that a little bigger than it was, but we also realized, and we noted in that preview, that South Carolina is who they are right now, and that is a team that's playing basically with one arm tied behind their back. They didn't have a lot of talent to begin with. They lost Debo Samuel. They lost a couple other players, I think Dowdle. And it's really kind of impacted what they can do from an already not so talented team, but they're managing to get wins, which the Kentucky loss I don't think is terrible. They're easily going to make a bowl this year. They're one of the better teams in the East this year, which I don't think is a great thing to say, but with all the turmoil going on around them, they can maybe take advantage of that. And obviously, Georgia is the juggernaut. So we know who we got with Georgia. We kind of know who we got with South Carolina at this point. I'm going to force you starting off because I think we know what the model's going to say. Maybe we don't. I think we're going to know who we're going to pick in this game. But I'm going to force you starting off to tell me a place where South Carolina could potentially have an advantage and expose Georgia in this game.
As you said, South Carolina's biggest issues have come due to losing players offensively. And I mean, it's just tough when you lose really your two most effective players. It's going to have an impact, and it takes some time to adjust from that. But I think maybe the good news is they seem to be adjusting. The South Carolina Vanderbilt game wasn't necessarily what you want to see in terms of blowing out a team of that caliber, but they were still pretty good offensively, I think, in that game. And I think there were some good signs. I don't know how good Vanderbilt's defense is, right? I mean, none of us kind of fully understand that. But A.J. Turner in that Vanderbilt game rushed for 8.1 yards per carry. Bentley rushed for 7.8 yards per carry. Denson rushed for 6.3 yards per carry. The really one guy that wasn't effective was Tyson Williams, strangely, but because he was 1.6 yards per carry, it was kind of an aberration with everyone else. But everyone else was pretty darn successful. And another thing that we've seen is that Jake Bentley can make any throw. And it's been said a lot this year, Georgia's opponents really struggle throwing the football. Missouri was the one team that could really throw theoretically at 8.5 yards per attempt, and they had a little bit of success at times throwing the football against Georgia. But outside that, the best pass team they faced theoretically is Vanderbilt at 6.7 yards per attempt, and Florida is right there at 6.6. I mean, those just aren't good passing offenses. So I think first off, there are signs that South Carolina's run game is kind of getting into rhythm. And I don't think they're dominant, but I think they can move the ball fairly well. But where I think South Carolina maybe has some potential is that South Carolina is probably the best overall passing offense that Georgia will have faced. I know Missouri has a higher total. Missouri's per play totals are a little screwy because Missouri is totally boom or bust. They'll throw one pass for 40 yards, and then they'll throw 6 straight incompletions or no gain receiver screens. And because they're so utterly inconsistent, you can't generate any points that way, right? If you throw a 40-yard pass, but you do it 1 out of every 10 plays, the odds of you getting the 2 or 3 40-yard passes in a row you need to score a touchdown are really darn slim. And even though your per play totals may look decent, your actual meaningful production is not gonna be. But again, when you look at what Georgia's faced, that 6.7 yard per attempt mark, Vanderbilt, I mean, let sort of put it in perspective. That's around 100th nationally is where what their opponents are, or worse. Basically, every one of them. Even Notre Dame isn't throwing the ball successfully at all. Bentley has the ability to make throws that can strain the Georgia secondary in a way that they haven't seen. Bentley is mobile enough to buy enough time to deal with Georgia's pass rush. I think Bentley is really inconsistent. So it's not necessarily something that we're going to see happen. And I'm not saying it's something I predict to see happen, but he can do it. And we've talked a lot that sometimes when you have these guys, I guess maybe a good analogy is quarterbacks can be like kickers, and that you have a quarterback that might be really, really accurate and good so long as you're only making him kick from within 30 yards. And then you can have another quarterback that has a huge leg and he can hit a 55 yarder, but he maybe he's 50% on 50 yarders and he's only 65% on 30 yarders. So they're kind of different players in different situations. Bentley is the latter. He can make any play on the field that you want him to make any throw to the boundary, to the sticks, flags, corners, whatever. He can do it all, but he will also miss a lot of routine plays. He'll make some boneheaded plays and he'll miss opportunities. However, when you're playing a team like Georgia that's very good defensively, you'd much rather have the guy that's capable of flash than the guy that is steady and consistent, because steady and consistent isn't going to beat Georgia. If you take the easy play that's there, they're too good defensively to be able to generate anything from it. What you need is Steven Garcia against Alabama. You need a guy that can have a game and step up and make some incredible throws that can beat really good defense and really good coverage. And given that Georgia really hasn't been strained at all defensively, most of their teams are 100th or worse in yard per attempt totals. I think there's a question there of whether South Carolina can succeed. So if you want me to be positive, I think that's a significant area. Now, again, just because it's an area where they can succeed doesn't mean it's necessarily an area where they will.
Yes, I want you to be positive for once. So I agree with you. I think you hit a pretty interesting point on the whole concept of Bentley being a gamer, really. And I think Garcia is a good sort of analogy, though I think Garcia is probably a little bit more polished as a passer, but maybe a little more volatile. But when he clicked, and he could have won the Heisman that day against Alabama. I think it was 2010. So that's a place that I agree. I think Bentley could potentially have some success against the South Carolina defense or against Georgia defense. My worry is they can't run the ball. I know their running game is getting better, but statistically, but they also are coming off a game against Vanderbilt, who me and you and a couple other guys could get together and get 4.5 yards per carry against Vanderbilt. It's not a literal statement, guys. It's hyperbole, but you know what I mean. So before we get into Georgia, because again, we kind of know what we got with Georgia, I want to touch on this thing as it relates to this matchup where South Carolina's got a 6-2 record, and that's good if you step back and say, coming into the year, going into week 10, 6-2 record, what do you think about that for South Carolina? You take that all day long. My concern is the concern that I always have with teams like this, and it's you have a pretty clean record, but you're playing really close and getting really close wins against really bad teams. And we're looking at yet another South Carolina win where they got outgained, which is the crazy aberration that I don't think I've ever seen this far into the season, to have this many games where you got outgained and you consistently won. So it's really weird. But is there something to that we should worry some about South Carolina maybe playing a little above their heads, and it's going to come home to roost at some point, that they're playing a 7-point win and a struggle against Vanderbilt, a 6-point win come from behind against Tennessee? These are bad teams, and they're playing them really close.
Well, I'm not sure I would say necessarily I'd worry about it, but I think there's probably a reason for it. And that's that South Carolina has played every game this season between 50 and 68 offensive snaps. That's not a lot. Most teams these days average over 70 snaps. Georgia, even though they keep being in blowouts, most of Georgia's games have been 70 plays or above. They've been more most of Georgia's play games have had more offensive snaps by Georgia than any game that South Carolina has played. When you shorten the game that much, when you have a game where both teams, play 50, 55 snaps, you're not going to have a lot of time to score a ton of points. Neither defense is going to get completely worn out. And so what ends up happening is you have a lower scoring game. Well, the more low scoring you are, the closer the game ends up being. So it's really hard to beat a team like South Carolina by 2 or 3 touchdowns when South Carolina just only lets you run 50 offensive plays. Now, that can be good and bad. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is it's sort of like dice rolls. The more you do it, the more you regress to the mean, meaning the more if you have a dice and you say, what are the odds of rolling a 1 or a 2? If you were to roll the dice 10 times and count how many times you rolled a 1 or a 2, it's not going to be 1 out of 3. If you rolled it 50 times, it's going to be a little closer. If you roll it 200 times, it's going to be closer. And to take that analogy and apply to football, it's actually, I think, fairly darn true. If you're a better team, the more plays you run, the more it shows up that you're the better team, partly due to depth, which everybody talks about a lot, but a lot of it is just taking out the inconsistencies. If I don't play many snaps, if I play 50 snaps, that random interception or kick return touchdown, random plays like we saw in the North Carolina State game, they end up mattering a lot more. And if North Carolina State had an extra 20 plays in that ball game, I think North Carolina State almost easily wins the ball game because North Carolina State was probably in many ways the better team. Statistically, they certainly were outgaining South Carolina 2-1, but because the game was short, North Carolina State basically didn't have enough time to overcome the weirdness early, and they managed to lose the game even though they outgained South Carolina 2-1. The flip side, South Carolina outgains Kentucky, but they lose 23-13 because that same problem came back to bite them. The game wasn't very long. They shortened it. Some stuff went against them, and they lose to a team by 10 that they actually outgained. Against Georgia, in a game where Georgia is probably clearly the better team, I think this is actually a good thing for South Carolina. We talk a lot that it's bad when you play close against bad teams, but we're usually talking about national title contenders, and I think we all realize South Carolina is not a national title contender. In this case, South Carolina is playing must-champ football. They're shortening ball games, and what it does is it basically, as we say this, we've said this in the past, we haven't talked about it a lot this year, the lower scoring the game is, the more volatile it is. And the shorter the game, the more lower scoring it is, the more a random punt return touchdown, fumble, interception, whatever matters. And it gives them a little bit more of a shot, I think, in this game than they would normally have because the variability comes into play a little bit more.
So I want to talk a little bit about Georgia because, we've had 2 weeks in a row with South Carolina, which I think is great because, like I said, going into the game that we talked about last week, that's a fan base that I love to death. I'm actually married to a South Carolina grad, full disclosure. And they actually, a lot of people, and I've said this before on the show, a lot of people don't realize this, even when South Carolina is not a good football team, they pack out Williams-Brice, and they have one of the coolest entrances in football. Everybody talks about Virginia Tech, which is awesome, but if you've ever seen a game there in South Carolina, it's a lot of fun too. So I love getting a chance to talk about them on the show, and I'm glad that they're 6-2, and I'm glad that we're going to get to talk about them in a bowl game because that's a program that I think that has some importance. So all that to say, I wanted to give South Carolina a little time on the show again this week. I also want to talk about Georgia. We picked Georgia blowout big against Florida. It wasn't a contest. We really didn't expect it to be a contest. I think we've accurately predicted every single Florida game this year, including the LSU game. So it was no surprise to us. And I know Georgia fans had this monkey on their back of Florida, and they've gotten it off their back. Because a lot of Georgia fans, if you talked to them last week, they were still worried about this game. They were talking, maybe 24-13, 24-17. It's Florida. You never know. I think Georgia is past that now. I think there's probably a little bit of lingering Mark Richt era stuff in that program, but if it is, it's not a lot. Georgia is playing more like that behemoth in the West than they are like the Georgia of old. So Having said all that, that has absolutely nothing to do with data. Are you seeing things like in this Florida game and like in games that they played throughout the year that tells you that a South Carolina that has historically given them some trouble really won't this year because Georgia is playing on a completely different level?
Short answer, yes.
Okay.
Georgia is really, simple point, they're running the ball and stopping the run far more consistently than they've done in recent years. And frankly, a lot of it, I think, is the transition from Rick to Smart. I was never impressed with the sort of mental and physical toughness that the teams had at Georgia under Rick. We've talked about it a lot, and we talked about it last week, so I'm not going to beat a dead horse here, but Rick really failed to get his team to the level where they could play an opponent in a big game and maintain the physicality and take some shots and give some shots and stay in the game and end up winning it. And then for whatever, I think a lot of people didn't appreciate just how much of a talent advantage Georgia had and still didn't manage to do it. And I think the talent advantage masked a lot of weaknesses, frankly, in the coaching staff and how they use people and how they played. They should have been a lot better than they were. We're starting to see them bring it to bear. It's a different coaching staff than it was. It's a different mentality. And Georgia's had 5-star tailbacks for a long time, but they haven't been able to take those 5-star tailbacks and dominate a ball game with them. They're able to do that now, and they're doing it consistently. And if you can do that consistently, then you look a lot like Alabama's looked in the past few years, and you can be a juggernaut against teams that are worse than you because you can pass the ball and you can have off days and you can have on days, and whether guys do or don't make a catch can make a big difference. But if you run the ball well, you will beat inferior teams consistently because if you can run the ball for 6 yards a carry, it doesn't matter what else you do, you can consistently get first downs. You're going to wear out the opposing team and you're going to score points. That's where Georgia's been. That edge and physicality is what's really helped them offensively. And then defensively, they're very aggressive and they're disruptive. We've talked a lot, though, that there are some issues that they've been playing teams that don't throw the ball very well. And so they're able to really sort of just attack the line of scrimmage and not fear getting burned in the passing game. Maybe that's a little bit of an edge here that's different, but I still think Georgia is just all around a lot more aggressive and attacking, and they're more than anything just, it's cliche, but they're more physical and consistent, and that goes a long way.
We've kind of beat Georgia up this year in terms of covering them top to bottom. We've done a good job, I think, of analyzing South Carolina the last 2 weeks. Let's go straight into the numbers. What does the computer model say with this one, and tell me whether or not you agree with it?
So it has Georgia 34, South Carolina 35. Sort of sit down for a second and we're going to talk about that because that's unusual. Now, we say this a lot on the show. We have a model that's been pretty successful. It's 15-3-2 against the spread. Don't necessarily think that's always going to happen. And everything about our model is designed to be as objective as possible. I don't introduce my own constants. I don't weight things. People sometimes say, "Well, how do you weight interceptions, or you need to consider consistency of the offensive line?" I had a bunch of suggestions, quote unquote, from Ohio State fans last week. How do you incorporate the offensive line consistency, or how do you incorporate weather or home field advantage? The problem with all these things is if you have a ton of data, you can maybe generate a number of how it's affected somebody historically. But for the most part, if you talk about offensive line consistency, your right tackle goes down. I don't have any data about how the backup right tackle is. He's never played. And so I don't use that kind of stuff in the model because maybe it might make it more accurate if I drew in recruiting rankings to try to do something. But then I have to give some weight to talk about how, whatever number or however I plug it in, I have to use that constant and have my own opinion on how the recruiting rankings are going to be reflected in the quality of the replacement right tackle. I don't do that. Everything I do is historical data completely. So every number is derived from something you've done in your past, and the way the numbers interact is based off the way they've interacted in the past. I do that so that we have an objective baseline for conversation, so that the model either supports or doesn't support our position, and we can talk about it so that if it does support it, then we can say, well, based on the past, this is a consistent sort of opinion and is consistent logic. Or we can say, well, there's reasons why we think things are going to deviate from history. 34-35 is a strange score. And if I take it out to decimal points, it's actually 34.3 Georgia, 34.5 South Carolina. So it's actually even significantly closer than that. But, and this is a big but, it's really all due to how weird South Carolina's stats are. Georgia defensively is excellent. 70% of opponent rush averages, 75% of opponent pass averages. That's elite on both counts. Now, we've talked about that the passing numbers are a little screwy. I think the rush numbers are fine. They faced pretty darn good rush offenses and fared well. Their opponent averages passing the ball is only 6.57 yards per attempt. That's 100th or worse nationally. Your average passing opponent is 100th. That's pretty bad. And 4.9 yards per attempt allowed is really good, and it's hard to distinguish when they're that bad. But also, when you play teams that can't pass at that level, passing offenses tend to sometimes just completely stop working. So the passing defense thing is, the model doesn't necessarily see this, but I think it's a little more shaky of a number one way or the other. I don't know. You can't distinguish yourself against bad teams. So sometimes you look better than you are, and sometimes you're actually better than even the numbers suggest. But the teams were so bad to start with that you don't look abnormal because they suck against everybody. South Carolina defensively, 94% against the run, 96% against the pass, average on both counts. And that's pretty much relative to SEC competition. But giving up about 95% of opponent averages means they're pretty much an average SEC defense on both sides of the ball. Again, they've held teams to not a ton of points, but I think that's sort of deceptive because they've played much shorter games under Will Muschamp style football than most teams. And again, the SEC East, strangely, it's got a lot of teams that don't run the ball very well, and they didn't play, Notre Dame, so their numbers are a little bit more skewed. The best rush attack they've faced is Missouri, oddly enough, and outside that, they've maybe A&M, North Carolina. None of these teams actually average 5 yards per carry. They're all below 5 yards per carry. So when you play everything against each other, it still says that Georgia is going to have a pretty good, significant statistical edge. 6.67 yards per play, almost 6 yards per rush, 8.7 yards per attempt for Georgia. And South Carolina is only going to run for 2.7 yards per carry, 5.4 yards per attempt. Total differential yardage, 6.67 yards per play for Georgia, only 4.1 for South Carolina. How does Georgia, outgaining South Carolina by almost 50%, over 50% per play, be predicted to lose? The short answer is, if you model South Carolina's points off yardage the way we do, it doesn't make a flippin' lick of sense. Their lowest scoring games were their most productive games. Against Kentucky and Louisiana Tech, they had the highest yardage totals that they've had all season. They averaged in those games 15 points. And then against North Carolina State, they only averaged 4.9 yards per play. So a yard and a half per play less than the other two games. And they got 35 points against North Carolina State. They had more points in a game in North Carolina State than they had in Kentucky and Louisiana Tech combined, even though they were significantly less effective offensively. And so my model, which is really unbiased, is trying to guess how points and yards are related, and it's basically inverted. As far as the model is concerned, South Carolina scores more points the less yards they get, because South Carolina's points are that screwed up compared to their offensive production. So I think you kind of have to take the model with a huge grain of salt here. And when I say huge grain of salt, I mean, I basically say you have to throw out this number, because I'm telling you, if I gave South Carolina less yardage, they would be predicted to score more points. That's obviously wrong. But the model's doing what it's supposed to. It's just dealing with the incomprehensible situation where a team over the course of 8 games has done better when they average less yards than when they average more yards.
Yeah, congratulations, South Carolina. All of your games that you've won where you've been outgained by your opponents has officially broken our model. I'm going to go first on this one. Obviously, I disagree with the model. And I think it's pretty important to note that South Carolina got points early in the year because Deebo Samuel was running kicks back for touchdowns. and they didn't have to traverse the field. And then they got a ton of points. I think 3 defensive scores against Arkansas that kind of hid that lack of production offensively. So that is huge to offenses that don't consistently move the ball down the field to be able to get. They're not cheap points. I mean, these points count just like all the others, but they're not points you have to get from your offense. So I think South Carolina is going to really struggle. I think their yards per run are maybe even a little high. I think they're going to run for under 2 yards per carry against Georgia, and I think they're going to get somewhere around 10 to 13 points. I think Georgia's going to be a little bit sort of have a letdown week after all the emotion of the Florida game, but I still think they're going to win pretty easily. Give me 34-13 Georgia.
Okay, and for my prediction, what I did instead of plotting the way this does, where I guess South Carolina's points based off predicted plays and South Carolina's history, I looked at Georgia's history, and I did this myself. So I said, okay, if Georgia's opponents averaged 4.1 yards per play, about how many points would they get? And the answer is about 14 points. That's where that projects. It's similar to App State, Samford, Vanderbilt. That's about what South Carolina's offensive production is supposed to look like. Those games ended up around the 2-touchdown range. So my guess with you, I think maybe it's a little high because South Carolina is going to shorten the game more than Georgia used to, if nothing else. But I also don't think South Carolina is going to move the ball particularly well at all. I mean, their best hope is have some big chunk plays. It's going to take a hero day from Bentley basically to keep them in this game. My prediction is Georgia 31, South Carolina again 14, and I think that's a lot more consistent with what these teams really have done historically.
So I hate going against the model in this game because the model's been so good to us. Again, I think it was at 15-3 against the spread with 2 pushes. But obviously, huge grain of salt this week. I think that's all to be said about Georgia, South Carolina. There's a huge game looming next week against Auburn, and we're going to really dig into that game and give it its due. Again, Georgia fans, South Carolina fans, give us your score. Give us a thumbs up. Give us a thumbs down. Let us know why you hate us. We're happy to talk to you in the comments.